Okay, so hello everybody. My name is Bradyn Ford, and I'll be starting our presentation here. We're going to look at fire intervals on the Craig Mountain WMA and how they have influenced the noxious weed communities there. So one of our research questions and objectives and hypotheses is that what are the effects of these fire return intervals on the invasive weed encroachments on Craig Mountain? Is there any benefits to the study area? And if not, what is different management techniques that could be done to help mitigate some of these encroachment and spread of these invasives? Also, we wanted to produce models that evaluated kind of change in stand dynamics through the use of VDT, ArcMap, and use different management scenarios to see how noxious weed encroachment might be resolved in these areas. And that we kind of hypothesized that increased fire intervals will permit greater noxious weed spread, and there'll be a loss in native vegetation, timber stand, and wildlife habitat without any increased management or community education or outreach. So a little background on Craig Mountain is that it was purchased in 1922 by a few agencies and became the WMA. Occupies about 124,000 acres and is comprised of a mix of conifer stands, shrub, and grassland steppes, and then meadow ecosystems with some riparian habitat. And it reaches an elevation of about 5,395 feet. It is owned and managed by multiple agencies, several state agencies, tribal, and private holdings. Also, the area is very well known for its recreational opportunities, hiking, hunting, camping, and climbing. Although with a whole host, the main objective for this area is really wildlife production, and maintaining species richness, diversity, and composition. Another thing I wanted to note was the bighorn sheep that were present in this area, which is a charismatic megafauna, and so this drives a lot of people to this area to pursue this big game. Some of the issues noticed in these areas were the noxious weed spread and trying to control them due to the fire intervals and protecting the main high quality stands, and then limit conifer encroachment into meadows. So getting on to our topic, fire intervals and noxious weed spread. So with increased fires, we're seeing a change in fire dynamics due to the lack of prescribed burns and grazing. One of the biggest fires noted in this area was the Maloney Creek fire in 2000 that burned 75,000 acres. That was about half of the WMA. And then more recently was the Craig Mountain Complex fire in 2017 that burned 55,000 acres with a host of other fires in between. And this showed that an increase in fire intervals from 7 to 3 years. And this was huge because noxious weeds were able to encroach into these recently burned areas. And these include cheatgrass, star thistle. And once they are in these recently burned areas in this virgin soil, they are able to quickly proliferate, steal nutrients, and outcompete native vegetation, especially saplings. And then they die during the summer, drying up, and increase the likelihood of a fire and increase the fire spread throughout the region. So some of the current actions being done to combat these noxious weeds are spraying weeds with biocontrol, done with crews and then aerial applications. And we also noted that with an increase of technician time and volunteer involvement, getting out there and spraying these areas post-fire as soon as these fires have gone through the area. Another thing is remote sensing and its applications in these areas, and identifying high priority areas of stands and native vegetation to go in and quickly treat after a fire is burned through to minimize the risk and spread of noxious weeds. And then another key thing that I wanted to bring up was ongoing undergrad research at the University of Idaho and using small imaging drones to go through and survey the area and note any vegetation regrowth after fires have burned through, and then note sapling recovery in its comparison to noxious weed spread. So now I'm going to pass it on to Morgan.
Hi everyone. So our study area is Craig Mountain, which is south of Lewiston on the northwestern side of Idaho. In ArcMaps, we use provided data to create the map on the right. The base map is just the United States, so that's just that plain green with the states outlined. And then I added the Craig Mountain boundary and made it hollow, so it's just a black outline, so you can see the fires within it. Super easy. Next slide. The process for getting that final map was first I added the base map to ArcMaps and made it a plane with the state boundaries, so you can easily see the contrast between the fires, the boundary, and the states. And then I inserted both the Craig Mountain boundary and the history of fires within the state of Idaho that were provided for the class. I changed the fill color to be hollow with the thin black line so it was more contrast for the boundary. And then after that, I made sure to select the boundary to use the selection tool. And then in arc maps at the top, I click selection, then selection by location, and set fire history as the target layer and the source layer to be Craig Mountain boundary. I set the spatial selection method for the target layers at intersect with the source layer feature. This selects the fires that intersect with the Craig Mountain boundary and created a layer from the selected features. And then I repeated that process, but instead of the intersect with the source layer feature, I changed it to are within the source layer feature and then created a layer from that. And there at the end, you get all of the fires that are within the Craig Mountain boundary. I'm done.
All right. So I'm going to go over the methods for our VDT analysis. For VDT, we had to create an entirely new model that portrayed the vegetation found in the Craig Mountain management area. The first steps in this model required disturbance code for fire to be added. Once this was done, cover classes with the correct successional stages were added. We added 3 management scenarios or fire intervals, occurring one every 10, 7, and 3 years. We then implemented a management plan for exotic spraying and native forb seeding to reduce the expansion of exotic species. Our linear model is presented below with a class type and successional stage key above the model. Class types went from A through H, starting with open herbland, transitioning into closed shrubland, then into stand initiation woodland, old multistrata woodland, and then back into open herbland following a disturbance. Next slide. So for our results, Figure 1 illustrates the historic fire regime of Craig Mountain over 100 years. Native species have a good representation, but a quarter of the landscape is expected to be exotic species. Figure 2 has an increased fire interval, having a fire every 7 years. This fire interval reduces native species in all class types and allows exotic species to make up 50% of the landscape. Next slide. So this is our third model, and this ran fire intervals every 3 years. After 100 years, exotic species still hold the greatest composition within the landscape, but soil health is most likely compromised due to the high persistence of exotic species in the previous timestamps. With climate being altered, it can potentially increase fire intervals to what we have modeled. If management agencies leave Craig Mountain untouched, biodiversity of native species could be drastically reduced. Next slide, please. So this is our last outputs for VDT, and the figures shown on this slide were run with a management plan aimed at reducing exotic species. The plan was to implement spraying of exotic species and seeding of native forbs every 2 years. Figure 4 had fire every 7 years, and Figure 5 had fire every 3 years. Timestamp 100 of both figures illustrates that by reducing exotic species in combination with increased fire intervals, soil health can be maintained by allowing native species to persist. The high amounts of exotic species seen in the previous figures reduces the quality of the soil. The exotic species suck up many of the nutrients, and when they burn, most of the nutrients go into the atmosphere and not the soil. And with that, I'll hand it off to Justin.
Thanks, Theo. So getting started with our discussion here. From our report, the original hypothesis that we came up with was due to the increase in fire return intervals, noxious weed encroachment will increase in distribution, causing a decline in native vegetation, as well as softwood recruitment, altering stand dynamics. So as we just saw in Theo's VDDT results, the Maloney Creek and Craig Mountain complex fires really resulted in a much lower percentage of native grasses and forbs, as well as a decrease in seedling establishment and recruitment in the conifers due to that increased fire return interval of only 3 years, as it had been 7 years previously. This increase in fire regime has created a predominantly weedy and grass-covered landscape due to the inability of conifer seedlings to become established with such short fire return interval. And also native grasses, forbs, and shrubs have been negatively impacted by the increase in the fire return interval, not just the bigger coniferous species. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of some supporting research here that we found. Richie Harrod had a report in 2001, and he stated noxious weeds have the ability to persist immediately after fires and colonize or pioneer disturbed areas of bare soil before seedling recruitment and establishment of coniferous species. And we can see this through that bottom left figure there with the 3-year fire return interval. You can really see that there's just not enough time for seedlings to become recruited and establish themselves before it burns again. And so it really just makes a prime environment for noxious weeds. Jared Parsons, this is an ongoing non-published grad student project, but he was using drone research to represent, or I guess capture how poorly the conifer stands have regenerated on Craig Mountain WMA with this 3-year fire return interval. And that's where that image in the middle there comes from. And then Andrew Mackey in 2019 had another report where he stated that the application of aerial herbicide treatments before establishment of noxious weeds is highly effective and allows pine seedlings and saplings much greater odds at establishment and recruitment. And this is where I use this bottom right figure here, which goes off of Theo's VDT, where we treated every 2-year have an herbicide application with a 3-year fire return interval. And as you can see, there's a great reduction in noxious weeds. Next slide. So moving on to conclusions and management implications, our VDT, ArcMap, and other modeling software programs can really help managers not only at Craig Mountain, but all over the world when trying to make proactive decisions about managing the spread of noxious weeds. And new developments in these software platforms will enable managers to more easily identify areas of native vegetation that are really highly susceptible to wildfire, as well as the spread of noxious weeds or noxious weed encroachment following fires. These areas then can be prioritized for treatment and directly following a fire to ensure the minimal amount of noxious weed encroachment in these areas of native vegetation. Also, increased community outreach and involvement, as Bradyn was mentioning earlier, can help minimize some of the inputs contributing to the spread of these weeds. Next, oh no, same slide, sorry. Our VDT results in particular can be highly useful in informing future use of herbicides to control weeds, especially in areas experiencing an increased fire return interval like they're experiencing on Craig Mountain. Climate change tools and modeling will have to be utilized in order to determine how future precipitation, temperature, snowpack, and other variables will respond to the changing climate. Also, climate change tools such as WorldClim, Prism, 3PG, and EcoShare can be useful in analyzing certain regions to predict how climate change may affect the region for unfavorable conditions in the future. But overall, this is really going to be an ongoing challenge due to the adversity and persistence of these noxious weeds to rapidly grow and outcompete native vegetation. It's really going to be an ongoing challenge for land managers to make or to prevent the spread of these weeds. And I'll open it up for any other comments.
I think we're good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So